Hello, it's Gene Tunney here. It's Monday evening on the 15th of June 2020, the year of the pandemic. I hope everyone's okay. In this video, I'd like to talk about the border issue, some of the recent data we've been seeing, and this issue of the Queensland Chief Economist, which has come up again. There was a story in the Australian recently by Sarah Elks. I want to say a few words about that at the end. But first, I should say it's reasonably good news. Well, it is good news if the border does reopen. The government's looking increasingly likely to reopen that border with New South Wales by the 10th of July. They still haven't fully committed to it. I think it will be difficult for them not to, given there no longer appears to be a compelling public health reason to keep it closed. So let's hope that reopens. Last week, CCIQ, so the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland, it received some media coverage for its estimates of the costs of keeping that border closed. There was an estimate that it's costing the economy $17 million per day, so around $500 million every month, $500 million, which is a pretty plausible estimate. Earlier last week, they had another estimate where they speculated that all of the restrictions could cost the Queensland economy up to $40 billion over the first 6 months of the year. I think that was a bit of an overestimate, quite a big one. We need to consider that the Queensland economy is about $360 billion in annual terms. That's the gross state product. In quarterly terms, around $90 billion. Forecasts of the contraction in June quarter that are credible in my view are around 8%, no more than 10%. A 10% contraction in June quarter would amount to around $9 billion, which is smaller than the estimate of CCIQ's, which was, I think it was $27 billion in that quarter potentially. So they've overestimated it. I think the reason they overestimated it was because they used the total sales figure from the business indicators publication from the ABS, which has duplication in it. It has double counting. It's not the proper measure of value added, which GDP or gross state product is. So, that said, I think look, good on CCIQ for campaigning, keeping the pressure on the government to ease those restrictions and reopen the border promptly, recognising that it is imposing a large economic cost, and good on them for encouraging them to reopen that border when it's when it's safe to do so, and not to be too cautious because it is imposing a very large cost on the economy. Okay, let's have a look at some of the recent economic data. Last week we had quite an encouraging report from, I think this is the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Index. We see that consumer sentiment has rebounded almost to the level that it was at before coronavirus, which is encouraging news. We see that business confidence is recovering too, but not quite as much as consumer confidence has. One thing we need to bear in mind is that the coronavirus, the social distancing measures that we've put in place to combat the coronavirus, they have had a large economic cost. We have 1.6 million Australians on the job seeker payment. We have the wages of over 3 million Australians subsidised via the JobKeeper program. So undeniably there has been a huge economic cost. We'll learn more about that this Thursday when the latest labour force statistics from the ABS come out. We will get the May statistics. Okay. One of the big pieces of news last week, and it's continuing today, is that markets have reassessed their attitudes. There's a concern about the pandemic. There's a concern about a second wave. There's a concern that economies may not recover as quickly as was once thought. The Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, made some remarks last week that led to a slump in the market. So we see the Australian stock market has fallen. Also, the US stock market fell. I think it was down nearly 5% last week. There was a slight tick up on Friday, but generally markets they're averse to risk again once more. And that's had an impact on the markets. It's impacting the Australian dollar because we're seen as one of those risky currencies. And so the Australian dollar was down today. It's gone down from, so it was 68.7 cents on Friday. Now it's 67.9 cents. So we've seen markets being affected by this change in attitude toward risk. On the US market, one thing I'd like to show you is a really great note from one of my favourite economists, Michael Knox, Chief Economist at Morgans, which is a Australian wealth management firm, a major one headquartered in the Riverside Centre in Brisbane. And Michael's someone that I know well through the Economic Society, and he always has really great insights into what's happening in the economy and the markets. And last week he published his great note, Economic Strategy, a third quarter correction for the S&P 500. So that's the US stock market. And Michael notes that, and he put this out even before the drop last week. He noted that on 8 June, our fair value had fallen to 2625 points, or 607 points lower than the actual level of the S&P 500 of 3232 points on the same day. Okay, so Michael is demonstrating via his modelling. So Michael's got econometric models of everything, and he has one of the S&P 500. He's estimating what the fair value of the US stock market is, and his model is confirming what a lot of people think, that the stock market is overvalued. And if you recall the figures I just flashed up before, so the S&P 500 is still above 3,000, and that's still significantly above what Michael considers the fair value of the market to be. I'll put this note of Michael's in the show notes so you can check it out. I encourage you to check it out. Michael's stuff is really good, and yes, get on his mailing list if you can. Right. The final thing I'd like to talk about is this story about the Queensland Chief Economist. So Sarah Elks, who's one of the journos at The Australian, who covers Queensland, she reported, I think it was in the Weekend Australian, that Queensland Treasury still hasn't filled this position of Chief Economist, which it advertised toward the end of last year. I think it advertised it in either October or early November. I remember being approached by the headhunter that they had engaged to find someone for the position. I think it was in early November because I was in Riyadh at the time, and I remember getting the message and thinking, I'm not sure this is something I'd be interested in because I would find it challenging doing what they required, which was essentially acting as an advocate for the government and having a public-facing role as an economist. They wanted someone with high-level political acumen. And I'm not sure how many economists would actually have high-level political acumen. Economists aren't renowned for having political acumen. They tend to be too outspoken. Alfred Kahn is a great example of that. He was the regulation czar who was appointed by President Carter, I think it was in the late 70s, and he had a habit of saying things that would get him into trouble, and at one time he had to start using the word banana instead of recession, which is quite an amusing story. It's very hard for economists to perform in those type of roles. I think economists do really well in treasuries and other government agencies, but I think it'd be difficult to be a chief economist for Queensland, where the government, where the treasurer, where the premier are expecting you to be an advocate for their policies and say how wonderful everything's going all the time. I just don't think that's a role. Well, it certainly didn't appeal to me, and I don't think it appealed to any of my colleagues who I think would be in line for a position like that. So I think it's unsurprising that they haven't been able to fill that position. Whether Queensland needs a chief economist or not, that's debatable. What we really need is for the existing Treasury to push more of their stuff out there, more of their analysis, more of their research. I'd like to see more of that in the public domain. I know they're going to be providing briefings on how the economy is going to the Treasurer, to Cameron Dick. They're going to be analysing policy proposals. I would like to see as much of that declassified and pushed into the public domain as possible. I think that would really improve the public debate. One point I've made in the past is it would be good if we could have a dedicated Office of Economic and Statistical Research again, as Queensland did in the 90s and the 2000s. I remember that organisation when it was at its peak under Peter Crossman and Christine Williams. I think they were doing really great work. I can't see why we can't have something like that again. Okay, well that's all from me. Thanks for viewing, and yes, I'll try to catch up with you sometime again soon. Thank you.